Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of the mini-series on the podcast, The Judean Revolt with Professor Guy Rogers. This episode being titled The War and the Destruction of the Temple. The series is based on his new book, For the Freedom of Zion, The Great Revolt of Jews Against Romans, 66 to 74 CE, published by Yale University Press. And as discussed, as mentioned in the first episode, is focused on a purely historical look at what happened, based on classical sources, mainly being Josephus and others. So once again, not a hashkafic or chazal-based discussion. In the first episode, we started the discussion with Herod, Hordus, and his reign and what happened until the outbreak of the war. This episode picks up the discussion with the massacres in Yerushalayim, the war, and through the Korban, with the aftermath and consequences being discussed in the final episode, episode 3. I would like once again to thank the sponsor of the series, AlephBeta.org. With Tisha B'Av approaching, to help you prepare for Tisha B'Av, I encourage you to check out Aleph Beta's collection of Tisha B'Av videos. Rabbi David Fohrman, founder of Aleph Beta, was a guest on the podcast, and which I once again encourage you to listen to if you're interested in to learn about his methodology, why he uses cartoon videos for Torah, and more. And his videos explore some of the most beloved Tisha B'Av texts to discover the deeper meaning and relevance of the day. And for listeners of the podcast, for a limited time only, you can get $18 off an annual Aleph Beta membership, which will give you access to all the Tisha B'Av videos, plus hundreds more on Parsha and the other holidays. All you need to do is go to alephbeta.org, that's ALEPHBETA.org, and enter coupon code SFARM22 when you check out. That's coupon code SFARM22, SEFORIM22, for $18 off an annual premium subscription. And there'll be links to Aleph Beta's website and to get the subscription in the show's notes below. Also, for anyone interested in the book, Professor Rogers' book, or in the Oxford Classics edition of Josephus, there'll be links in the show's notes as well. And Farm Chatter now is part of Amazon Associates. So for anyone that would like to use those links or others to support the podcast that way, be much appreciated. And as always, if anyone has any questions, comments, or feedback about this episode, this series, or anything else, or would like to sponsor an episode or support the podcast, please email me sfarimchatter@gmail.com or check out the website sfarimchatter.com. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'll be joined once again by Professor Guy Rogers, who is the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Classics and History at Wellesley College. And this will be the second part of our mini-series, which is based on his book, For the Freedom of Zion, The Great Revolt of Jews Against Romans, and published by Yale University Press. And this is about Korbanos and the Beis HaMikdash and the war against the Romans. So thank you once again, Professor Rogers, for joining me.
Well, thank you again. My pleasure.
So let's start off where we left off of last time, which was in your book. It's the end of part 1, or the beginning of part 2, chapter 7, but which is after there was the massacre in Jerusalem, in Yerushalayim, and now what happens from there after this massacre takes place.
Right. So right after the second massacre, there was kind of an uprising in the city itself. And in fact, the Jews who had seen what happened sort of grouped themselves together and managed to break down, to destroy these porticos or stoas, which connected the Temple Mount to the Antonia Fortress, which was kind of the garrison fortress for the local auxiliary troops. And so they, in essence, they cut the Temple Mount off from the Roman authorities. And so at that point, in essence, Florus was in a very, very difficult position, and he in fact left the city and kind of abandoned his soldiers there. And so for a little while afterward, a kind of calm prevailed, and of course, within the city, there was conflict about how to follow up what had happened. but the kind of first intervention to quiet things down came from this guy, King Agrippa, Marcus Julius Agrippa, who was the son of King Agrippa I. So Marcus Julius Agrippa is Agrippa II. He was born around 30 CE or so. And when he was a young man, the Emperor Claudius basically had given him a kingdom, which was comprised of some of these regions to the east and northeast of the River Jordan, these places called Botania and Trachonitis and Gaulanitis, which essentially is part of the Golan Heights. And these were areas where definitely most of the people were non-Jews. Subsequently, the Emperor Nero added a couple of places with mixed populations, but significant numbers of Jews. For instance, Tiberias on the west coast or the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, but also Tarakai. So Agrippa II was this young king that the Romans had kind of identified as sympathetic to them and a good representative for their interests in the region. So Agrippa shows up in Jerusalem after the massacres and after the departure of Florus, and he made a long speech, which is reported by Josephus, essentially to try to persuade the population that they needed to, stop and repent. I won't go into all the details about the speech. I'll just mention a couple of the main lines of argument. One of which was that although the individual Roman governors might be harsh, the Romans themselves weren't necessarily unjust. And what he means by that, of course, are the emperors. And then Josephus says that he went into this section about it being really about the goals of what they were doing, which are characterized as a revolt. And basically, he has Agrippa say that if they really wanted liberty, it was much too late for that the Romans had been around for too long. And then he goes into a comparison of the resources of the Romans and the Jews, which, of course, favored the Romans. And then finally, he sort of wrapped up with this ending about how there would be no assistance forthcoming from God, and that there would be no mercy in the war. So it's a highly rhetorical speech. It's a long speech in Josephus's text. Of course, we can't really know whether Agrippa actually made that speech or not. But in the form in which we have it, of course, it's a product of Josephus's pen or stylus in the city of Rome in the late 70s. And I think it's important to remember that Agrippa II was one of the people that Josephus says that he circulated copies of his work to before he published it. So as you read through this speech, and think about what it is that is attributed to Agrippa, it sounds a lot like a kind of ex post facto, I told you so speech, because virtually everything that Agrippa says in the speech kind of comes true, including the idea that, God isn't going to help you out during this war. So, so I think that the speech in the form in which we have it has to be taken with a grain of salt. And there are parts of it which are kind of overtly specious, I would say, like this argument that although the governors may be unjust or harsh, it doesn't mean that the Romans themselves are unjust. But, the people in Jerusalem were interacting with the Roman governor, not with the emperor, as it were, during these massacres. So I think that there are some parts of it that are problematic factually as well. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
The one thing I was going to jump in, but just about Agrippa generally, before we go on from him, is that, notwithstanding the accuracy of the speech, like you said, or the lack thereof, but what was his place in the war? I don't think we mentioned him, in the previous episode, and I know he'll come up probably a little bit again later on. I mean, what was his kind of place in all this?
Well, right. I mean, actually, this is, if this were an opera, this is his entrance. This is his big aria at the beginning of the opera. And he's going to be a major player in the narrative. Subsequently, he tried to intervene by actually sending troops down into Jerusalem, and that failed. And then, basically he went over to the Roman side, and not just kind of at the level of propaganda or moral support, but he actually accompanied Cestius down to Jerusalem when Cestius, the Roman legate of Syria, brought a big army down to Jerusalem to try to snuff out the revolt. So he is on the Roman side for the rest of the revolt. And just to telescope ahead a little bit, after the destruction of the temple and the conquest of Jerusalem, he goes to Rome and kind of lives there as an honored ally of the Romans and receives honors from the Romans as well. So, there was not much doubt, as it were, whose side he was on in this war. So the interesting thing, though, after the speech is that Josephus says that that the people who listened to it felt sort of, chastened by the speech and began to go up to the porticos, which had been, torn down, and began to rebuild them. So to kind of reconnect the Temple Mount with the Antonia fortress. So the population of Jerusalem kind of took his point, and I think it shows that they did not really want a war against the Romans. But at that point, Agrippa also told them that they had to give obedience to Florus. They had to accept Florus. And that was the point at which they just said, basta, we're not doing it. We're not going to accept that. And as I said last time, I really think that that's the sign that the Rubicon, as it were, was crossed by these massacres. They just were not willing to put up with rule by somebody, who had killed their fellow Jews, Jewish civilians. And when Agrippa was trying to, persuade them to do this, they, in time-honored sort of fashion in the Middle East, they began throwing rocks at him and kind of drove him out of Jerusalem. So that was sort of the end of this peaceful or semi-peaceful intervention by by Agrippa. So go ahead.
So now I think you're probably going to get this, but then something else occurs, which is, you discuss whether this was considered revolt or not, which is they stopped offering their Korbanos, the sacrifices, for the Romans, for the emperor.
Right. This is actually the background to the cessation of the sacrifices at the temple or in the temple, and I think it's important first to say what happened and then to try to explain it a bit. Essentially, the guy who was the temple captain, kind of the guy in charge of security on the Temple Mount, this guy Eleazar, who was the son of the former high priest Ananias, convinced the priests who were responsible for conducting those sacrifices not to receive or any sacrifices or gifts from any foreigners or outsiders. And Josephus says that this was the foundation of the war. Foundation would be a translation of this Greek word katabole. I'm not sure that that's a great translation of it, but what he means by that is the starting point, really, of the war itself. My own personal opinion is that also isn't factually correct or contextually correct. Readers of my book will, of course, know that, I think that what happened in Caesarea and then the rioting and massacres in Jerusalem were the real beginning of the war. But of course, Josephus was a Jerusalemite, came from a well-off family, was part of the priestly hierarchy himself, and so for him, this is a key point. So, what were these sacrifices about? Josephus implies that these were the twice daily sacrifices that were made for Caesar, and by that Caesar is meant the Roman emperor, whoever the current emperor was, and the Roman people. And they comprised a bull and 2 sheep. The first century CE Jewish Alexandrian polymath Philo says that these sacrifices had been subsidized since the time of Augustus by the Romans themselves. There's a lot of scholarly argument over whether the Romans paid for them or whether the Jews did, but that's not what's crucial for us here. What's important for us is what it is that the sacrifices really represented and what stopping them meant. If you read a lot of scholarship about this episode, what you're going to find is that a lot of scholars would argue that stopping the sacrifices was a kind of declaration of war against the Romans. I argue against that. I don't think that if you think about the sacrifices themselves, I don't see how stopping them is a declaration of something as aggressive as war. The purpose of the sacrifices, whoever paid for them or subsidized them, was to signal that the people carrying them out wanted to intervene with their God, presumably on behalf of the health or well-being of either or both the emperor and the Roman people. So ceasing the sacrifices means, to me, that they're no longer willing to be the go-between, as it were, between the Romans and their God. That, to me, doesn't mean that you're declaring war on the Romans. It just means that there's something that the Romans have done, which they did, which is massacre a lot of Jews, so that you're no longer willing to have your God intervene on their behalf. So I wouldn't call this a declaration of war. I think it's something closer to a kind of declaration of independence from the Romans. It means that they are not willing to make these sacrifices to their one and only God on the Romans' behalf. And I think that my argument is kind of supported by the iconography and the inscriptions, which the people who were in charge of having coins minted on behalf of the rebels during the first 4 or 5 years of the rebellion had made. So we have a lot of these coins, both silver and also especially bronze coins, from years 3 and 4 of the war. So sort of 68, 69 of the war, which have on them inscriptions in either Hebrew or in Paleo-Hebrew, the older sort of letter forms of Hebrew, which include the words. There are different inscriptions, short inscriptions, but some of them have on them "for the freedom of Zion." And to me, an inscription like that in Paleo-Hebrew, first of all, represents a conscious choice to use a form of their script, which probably a lot of Jews wouldn't have been able to read. So it was a conscious choice to go back to a script which went back into the history of the people. Zion, of course, was a hill to the south of Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. But by this time period, that is the 60s CE, Zion was also synonymous with the city of Jerusalem, with Israel, but Israel not just as a physical place, but as a people and as an idea. And of course, with the history of that idea, which included, an independent nation at one time. So for me, these are connected. Taking control of the sacrifices, the cessation of sacrifices for the emperor and the Roman people, and the assertion of the independent nationhood of Zion are connected. So that is the argument that I would make. Unfortunately, it didn't preclude fighting among the different groups who were kind of vying over who was going to be the leader of this independence movement against the Romans. And this is the point at which I would argue this becomes not just the war of Jews against Romans that Josephus talks about at the beginning of his work, but also the war of Jews against other Jews. And alas, unfortunately, by around about the middle of August on the Gregorian calendar. We know that the former high priest Ananias and his brother Ezechias were killed by some of the followers of this guy Menachem, who was the son of Judas the Galilean, which incidentally connects the revolt in 66 with the uprising which took place in 6, or at the very beginning of the imposition of the census in Judea. So there is a connection now between what happened earlier in the century and the first few months of the rebellion itself. Interestingly, Ananias's followers, including Eleazar, weren't happy about the murder of the ex-high priest, Ananias. And so his followers hunted down Menachem and some of his supporters and then murdered them as well. And there's one little other detail about this fighting that was going on in the immediate aftermath of the cessation of the sacrifices too, which is that one of Menachem's relatives was this guy, Eleazar ben Yair, who apparently escaped and made his way to Masada and becomes kind of the leader of the group of people who stay in Masada until the Romans track them down years later. So these are all, we're sort of setting in place some of the parts which are going to help us to understand the story as it develops. The final piece of the story, I would say Act 1 of the story, is that after the deaths of some of these early leaders of the rebellion, we were sort of still left with the Roman auxiliary garrison in Jerusalem. And there were negotiations between Eleazar and his followers and the Romans about them leaving the city. And they came eventually to an agreement. But unfortunately, when the Romans began to leave the city and laid down their arms, they were massacred. And that led in turn to a massacre of most of the Jews in the coastal city of Caesarea, and then this explosion of interethnic violence really throughout the region. So both in Gentile majority towns, or villages, towns, and then in Jewish majority towns and cities, these populations began to fight each other and, if possible, to massacre each other. So this is war, as it were, number 3. So we have the Jews against the Romans, we have Jews against Jews, and now for the next 7 or 8 years, we're going to have Syrians, Greeks, and actually other sort of regional peoples against Jews as well. So interethnic violence.
Yeah, this is all, outlined much more in depth in the book, even more than we already discussed. So then we're up to really chapter 8, but then Cestius, the Roman governor of Syria, comes in. He decides to bring an army. He's going to put this down, and that's just an epic disaster occurs after that.
Right, exactly. So, Cestius originally he had sent a tribune, a military tribune, down to Jerusalem before all of this happened, just to get somebody to report to him about whether the Jews in Jerusalem were on the verge of revolt or not, and basically received a positive report from this guy, and then obviously the fuse went off afterward. And Cestius realized that he was going to have to go down and try to snuff this out. So he put together an army. It took him kind of a while. He had to just kind of call some legionaries from their base in Syria, and then also muster some auxiliaries and some regional allies. In the end, the army that he put together was somewhere between about 30,000 soldiers and maybe 36,000 soldiers. But the key thing to realize about Cestius's army is that it was very light on Roman legionaries. There was really only one sort of standing Roman legion, and then some other legionaries who were taken from other legions. So basically what he was going to try to do was to tamp down the revolt with auxiliary soldiers, sort of locally recruited militia soldiers, and then also allies from the region.
Let me just jump in. I know we're going to get back to Cestius in a second. For listeners that may not be familiar, if you could just describe briefly what a Roman legion and a legionary is, and then how that is different from an auxiliary. What is this? What's going on over here?
Right. So a Roman legion is essentially a large infantry unit. There's unfortunately kind of a lot of controversy about how many infantrymen there are in a Roman legion at this time, and Josephus doesn't provide exact figures, but it's somewhere between 4,800 and 6,000 infantrymen on paper. As with every other kind of military unit in the history of military units, that's the paper strength of it. How many people were on leave, injured, wounded, sick, et cetera, we never really know exactly, but it's around between 4,800 and 6,000 that are divided up into these sort of tactical units, which are called cohorts. So in a cohort, there would have been 480 soldiers, and they were subdivided further into what were called centuries, or centuriae in the plural, of about 80 soldiers. And then the smallest unit is just a kind of squadron of 8 guys. But the basic fighting units are these cohorts of 480, which are usually in combat situations put together in like a checkerboard formation. That's how the Romans lined up at the beginning of battles. They usually fought with cavalry units on their wings. In a legion, there were 120 or so guys who are kind of what we would call cross-trained. Originally, they were infantrymen, but they also served as cavalrymen. Basically, the Roman cavalrymen served as scouts and people who protected the wings of the infantry, the sides of the infantry. For real cavalry, the Romans tended to rely on those auxiliaries who were recruited locally. Most of the auxiliaries that were serving in this area at the time were non-Jews, and this caused a lot of problems. In the run-up to the war itself, a lot of the agitation that there was between the civilian Jewish population and the Roman presence came through these auxiliary soldiers, most of whom were Greek or Syrian, Greek descended or Syrian, and were not sympathetic to the Jews. So in Cestius's army, there were auxiliary cavalry, but also auxiliary infantrymen. The size of their units were smaller. They tended to be between 500 and 1,000. And then there were allied formations, regional kings like the king of Comagene, the Nabatean king, who, when the Romans sort of snapped their fingers, would turn up with thousands of soldiers to assist their allies. So this combination army that Cestius brought together and marched them down from Antioch to Ptolemais, modern Akko in Israel, and then engaged in some sort of punitive operations in the Galilee, but pretty quickly then brought them down to the area of Caesarea to try to intimidate, if possible, the population. Unfortunately, what was going on at the same time in Jerusalem, of course, after the massacre of the Roman garrison there, the Jews knew that there would be a Roman reaction. And so they did set up a kind of command under the direction of these two guys, Joseph, the son of Gurion, and then a guy named Ananas the second, who was another former high priest. He was a Sadducee, which is important to note because, again, it just shows that this was not a revolt of outsiders, which is often the way that Josephus presents it. So what they did was they selected a group of generals who were to be sent out to be kind of the commanders in these 6 territories that they divided up responsibility for. And of course, the most well-known of them would be Josephus, who was given command of the 2 Galilees and also Gamala. Interestingly, excluded from any sort of leadership position were any zealots or our friend Simon, the son of Giora, who had sort of terrorized his fellow Jews and also some Romans before this. So they did put together a command structure and sent these guys out. The only one that we really know about, or the only case that we really know about, is Josephus's, because he tells us what he did, which was supposedly to put together an army that was kind of a mirror image of a Roman legion, except that it was supposedly 60,000 men strong, which is totally impossible. 60,000 Galilean soldiers never appear in the war itself. And even more importantly, he tells us that he sort of fortified all of these places in the Galilee and in the north. And that's hugely important for everything that happens in this war, because What it means is that from the very beginning, before the first real Roman army showed up, the strategy that Josephus, and we know others followed it as well, was to fight the Romans by fortifying villages and towns, and as it were, inviting attacks against them. And unfortunately, that turned out to play to the Roman military strengths. The Romans had been, besieging cities for hundreds of years. And in my book, I argue that essentially it was at this point when this strategy was decided upon that the course of the war became likely. So that was the Josephian strategy. It became complicated in the north because Josephus also got himself into a rivalry with this guy, John of Gischala, who was kind of this local strongman, businessman, and influential figure in the north. And as it turned out, a rival of Josephus for really who was going to be the leader of the resistance in the north. And that eventually led to the leadership in Jerusalem recalling Josephus to Jerusalem to find out minimally what was going on. So the leadership situation there was very, very complicated. And meanwhile, of course, Cestius brought his army down, and probably at the advice of Agrippa II, took the army along a route from the coast to Jerusalem, which brought them through the hills of Beit Horon. And on the way in, going through these hills, Cestius's army was ambushed and suffered casualties. They eventually got into Jerusalem. But when Cestius got into Jerusalem, he realized suddenly that the resistance there was far greater and more determined than apparently he had been led to believe. And so he spent a couple of weeks in the city, but he didn't have siege equipment with him or enough siege equipment, nor had he planned a kind of logistical supply system that could supply his army during a long siege. And so he was kind of forced to retreat from Jerusalem. And on the way back, in mid-October of 66, he was attacked again by the rebels. And Josephus says that 5,300 Roman infantry were killed, and something like 480 cavalry. What that means, therefore, is that Cestius and his army suffered the equivalent of the loss of a Roman legion and one of those auxiliary cavalry cohorts. those are massive losses. Out of, if his army was 30,000 men, that's, 1/5 of his army. So if any commander in any sort of tactical situation these days loses 1/5 of his soldiers, that's the end of his career. So this was a huge disaster for the Romans, a huge disaster. Not their greatest military disaster ever. The Romans actually specialized. If you look back into the history of the Roman Republic, hundreds of years before, one of the unique things about Roman Republican and imperial history is how many disasters the Romans encountered or suffered, and yet continued to fight and ended up winning the wars. So this was just another one, but a very embarrassing one, of course, for the Emperor Nero. Embarrassing both on a, sort of a propaganda level, but also problematic because, of course, what Nero was after was, the steady sort of supply of resources from people in this region, including from the Jews, meaning the money, as it were, the tribute. So he had to do something about it. It was also rather kind of inconvenient because he was on a concert tour, as it were. Nero fancied himself to be a great singer and poet. So he happened to be in Greece on tour at the time, from August of 66 to December of 67. And he knew he had to replace Cestius. And the guy he came up with was this guy, Vespasian. Vespasian came from a middle-level socioeconomic background family from the so-called Sabine Hill country outside of Rome, to the east of Rome. His father had been a tax collector, and Vespasian had gone into the military as a young guy, eventually became a legionary commander during the invasion of Britain by the Emperor Claudius, and then became a consul and governor of his own province, the province of Africa. So he was a guy who had a decent track record of success and wasn't known as being terribly charismatic. So he was sort of perfect for Nero. Nero thought he could send Vespasian there, he would mop things up, and that would be the end of things. So he selected Vespasian. Vespasian, in turn, got his son, this guy Titus, who was a young man, to help him to muster another army, which was put together by mid-April of 67 to squash this revolt. This was a much bigger army with a much bigger legionary corps, 3 full legions, a bunch of other cohorts, a lot more auxiliaries and also allies. So finally, at least 50,000 combatants, which shouts out that by now they had decided that they had to crush this rebellion. So starting in the spring of 67, Vespasian unleashes this army on these places that Josephus had fortified. And I can't go into all of the details, but the two biggest and most important confrontations took place at Iotapata in May and June of 67, where Josephus was the commander. And then at Gamala in October of 67. Iotapata, of course, Iotapata is incredibly important for a number of reasons. First of all, because Josephus was the commander there, and he gives us in his work kind of a "you are there" eyewitness account of what it's like to be besieged by a Roman army. And then after Iotapata was conquered by the Romans, after a siege which lasted somewhere between 38 to 47 days, Josephus survived the siege, hid in a cistern with a few dozen other people, and eventually surrendered to the Romans after surviving a kind of death lottery, which he and another guy organized. And when they came down to the last two lots, as it were, Josephus and his fellow organizer decided that they wouldn't go through with it. So Josephus surrendered and eventually was brought to Vespasian and prophesied to Vespasian that Vespasian would be the ruler of the Roman world. So Josephus saved his own life by, as it were, encouraging most of the rest of the defenders of Iotapata to fight to the death, and then surviving himself, and then going over to the Roman side. For which, of course, since antiquity, Josephus has been reviled by many people. He claims in his work that he had dreams in which he had learned or he had been persuaded that he was going to be the announcer of this Roman triumph. So that's the way that he, essentially assuaged his conscience, perhaps. I think it's an interesting story. I think that it's also interesting why it is that the Romans, Vespasian and company, didn't just kill him on the spot. Probably, very likely, Vespasian realized that Josephus could be put to work for the Romans. He was a well-known figure. He was a general. So that's the reason why he accompanies Vespasian and then Titus during the rest of the campaign.
Yes, if I could just jump in a couple of points before we continue at this point. So first of all, just going back to before, just when you talk about Cestius, the book goes very much in depth. And as you mentioned in the first episode, there's there's a lot of military history and military tactics and things in here. So it's very interesting. You discuss, like you were mentioning, the size of the army, and you break it down. And the book mentions, how many pack animals they would need and how much food they would need. And there's appendices about that. It's really interesting stuff if anyone's interested in that. Then you also mentioned John of Gischala, like you said. Other people may know him as Yochanan of Gischala. We'll actually get to his surrender now, I guess, his own in the Galilee. But one other thing you mentioned of Josephus going out and telling Vespasian. So listeners may be familiar. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the one who did that, and Josephus, as he was. There's actually a 2-volume set came out a number of years ago. I think Yad Yitzchak ben Tzvi, ben Josephus leChazal, between Josephus and Chazal, and this is one of the articles in there. It does discuss this, and there's other things, but just mentioning what Josephus says over here. We're just discussing at this point. So, getting back to what you were saying, I guess we're up to John or his surrender, and then Vespasian. What happens from there?
Right. So after Iotapata, there were some kind of minor operations. Eventually, Vespasian and company end up on the Golan Heights, where in October of 67 they conquer Gamala. I hate to mention this, but it is part of the story. That in the kind of the final scenes that Josephus describes with the conquest of Gamala, he talks about how the Romans, when the civilian population and the last soldiers of the rebels there were kind of pushed up to the citadel area, the Roman soldiers took babies and infants and threw them over the cliffs to kill them. So I think, this is war, and it's important not to just sort of forget the atrocities that were committed. There were atrocities committed by Jews in the war, the massacre of the Roman auxiliary garrison in Jerusalem, but there were a lot more atrocities committed by the Romans. And I also think it's interesting that Josephus doesn't omit that in his work. And that's why I say to people that we can talk about Josephus as a traitor to the Jewish people, but we also have to realize that, he includes details about the war and Roman actions, which also could not have played well with certain Romans as well, if they had any humanity. So I just think it's important to note that. So after Gamala, the one last place that there was any kind of resistance was at Gischala, where, it's kind of the home base of John or Yochanan. Titus goes up there, and actually John tricked him and escapes with his followers, and also a lot of civilians, some of whom unfortunately were murdered by the Romans as well. And John makes his way down to Jerusalem and becomes one of the leaders of the resistance. Josephus has nothing good to say about John of Gischala. The more bad things he says, and some of the things he says about him kind of create this mirror image, unfortunately, of Josephus. And Josephus's trickery and kind of double dealing, I think you could say. So he's kind of an interesting foil for Josephus. But for our narrative, I think the key point is that what this means is that essentially in 7 months, so from the spring of 67 to October of 67, the war in the Galilee is over. The war in the north is over. It's pacified, as it were, by the Romans. And that leads then, or would have led, to Vespasian, I think, marching down and closing off all the approaches to Jerusalem and besieging Jerusalem. But then something kind of really extraordinary happened, which was that a Roman governor named Vindex revolted against Nero. He was the governor of this place, Gallia Lugdunensis, which essentially is the east, central, and northern section of Gaul. So in late 67, yep, go ahead.
Gaul being France.
France, right, exactly. So in late 67 and early 68, there's a rebellion against Nero. So while Vespasian is beginning operations to try to isolate Jerusalem, over in Rome and in the western part of the Roman Empire, there's a major rebellion which suddenly Nero has to deal with, and he doesn't deal with it very well. And by June, on June the 9th of 68, Nero commits suicide, and that leads to a big civil war among Romans and Romans who want to succeed Nero. So in fact, this is among Roman historians, 68-69 is known as the year of the four emperors. So we have Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and then eventually Vespasian, okay? But so now we have another war going on. We have a fourth war, as it were, a Roman civil war. So this is now a pretty chaotic world. On the 1st of July of 69, the legions in Alexandria decided that Vespasian should be emperor. So they start supporting him, as does the legate, the governor in Syria as well. And that leads to Vespasian departing for Rome and leaving his son Titus to finish off the war in the south, which means, of course, the siege and conquest of Jerusalem. So Titus now leads this large Roman army to the outskirts of Jerusalem, which he arrives at before Passover of 70 CE. And this army is a legionary heavy army. It's got 4 main Roman legions plus cohorts from Syria, a large amount of cavalry. So a minimum of 48,000 soldiers with almost 20,000, a minimum of 20,000 legionaries, which means that Titus understood that taking Jerusalem was only going to come about as a result of fighting done by Roman legionary soldiers. This one could not be offloaded onto allies or Greeks and Syrians, no matter how much they disliked the rebels, the Jews, because they were not up to the task. It would have to be fundamentally a Roman military operation. At one point, Josephus tells us that there were more than 20,000 kind of hardened rebel soldiers now within the city of Jerusalem. They were split into factions, the Zealots led by Eleazar, John and his northern guys, the Galileans, and then Simon Bar Giora, and then for a while the Idumeans as well. So they were sort of split and fighting kind of, or having responsibility for the defense in different sections of the city. Josephus's account of the siege itself is a classic account of a siege of an ancient city. We can't go into all of the details about the back and forth fighting that there was. But essentially what the Romans did, of course, was to use artillery, field artillery, to clear defenders from the walls by shooting stones and arrows and bolts at them, and then bringing battering rams up to the walls to make holes in the walls, to collapse the walls. The Romans had the enormous advantage of being able to bring food and supplies in from the outside to feed their soldiers. And we happen to know that these supply lines were organized to bring supplies from as far away as Syria to the Roman soldiers, so a long way away. Whereas the people in the city, the Jews in the city, the defenders of the city, had what they had within the city, basically. That was it. So obviously, almost inevitably, apart from the fighting itself, famine became a huge problem. And Josephus progressively tells the story of how famine eventually had a grip on the city and rendered a lot of the soldiers essentially ineffective as fighters. And the civilian population suffered even more because, of course, what food they had went usually to the soldiers. And this ends with this famous story about the cannibalism of this woman, Miriam or Maria, who had come from the Pariah, from one of the places to the east of the Jordan River into the city, and had sort of gotten trapped in the city during the siege. And Josephus relates this story of how when she was starving to death, she killed her kid, her son, a baby son, and ate part of him. And some of the rebel soldiers who were going around trying to find people who had food were so appalled by this that they, these hardened, tough guys, had to kind of run away from her. So it's a very interesting story in many ways. The case that I would make about that story is, first of all, Josephus wants his readers to be appalled by the story. But he also wants to use it, as it were, to justify what comes next, really, in his account of the siege itself, which is the Roman breakthrough. There were 3 walls in the city. Josephus uses this cannibalism story as the kind of intro into the Romans breaking through the last wall and then assaulting the Temple Mount and destroying the temple. And he puts into Titus's mouth this short speech about how people who have descended to this level of eating their own are no longer human, which I see as a blatant attempt to justify their actions at the end of the siege. And that sort of leads into the story of the destruction of the temple. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to jump in before we get obviously to the unfortunate climax, the Korban bias, the destruction. Of course, we're glossing over a lot. I just want to make mention, the book does go much, much more in depth. There's like 100+ pages on what we said here. Especially when they gets to even before going all the way back. Just want to reference earlier, we ran through, the siege of Iotapata, Galil, and with Josephus. You go very in depth on that. But then going over here in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, you talk about, like you said, you really describe the warfare and how that took place and how, the defense, there were sorties, they were coming in and out to fight with the Romans, and they were successful in some instances, as well as you discuss all this in depth over here. So that's something I just wanted to point out. Also, another thing that we kind of mentioned, glossed over, is the infighting that was going on in Jerusalem, in Yerushalayim, the burning of the grain, and there was the fighting amongst the Biryonim, so the zealots and the non-zealots. A lot of that. There's a lot of that, and obviously it's all in the book. Everyone, again, I said this last episode, and this one again, there will be a link to purchase the book in the show's notes. It's all in the book in depth. We're just trying to get through as much as we can without this being denser than it is, so people can get a overview of the story. But we want to hear more, of course, check out the book.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. I mean, obviously, people can read the book for all of the details, but just picking up on one thing, and then we can talk about the destruction of the temple. I think it's really incredibly interesting that when Josephus is describing the fighting, the individual encounters between the Romans and the Jews, not the artillery barrages, not the battering ram and stuff like that. In the individual fighting, more often than not, the Romans lost the sort of the combat, as it were. So they didn't. The Jews, the rebels, did not get outfought. What happened was that the supply system of the Romans and the superior numbers sort of attritioned them to death, as it were. That's why they lost this final battle. And what that does is that it speaks to this issue of morale, which is a hugely important issue in warfare. So I don't want to, in describing what's happened and what's about to happen, I don't want people to get the impression that even Josephus is arguing that in some sense people gave up. They didn't give up. They didn't give up at all. In fact, remarkably, Josephus cites some instances toward the very end of the siege where individual Jewish soldiers stood up on the walls and said to the Romans down below them, "We know we're going to lose, but we don't care. We're going to be fighting to the end. That's it." Because we have this one master. It's unbelievable, actually. It's amazing. And it's amazing that it finds its way into Josephus's text. Indeed, all of that is there in the text, including the infighting as well. So about the temple and kind of the final scene. Of course, this is a very kind of emotional and controversial episode in the war, and what happens has kind of reverberated through the ages. There also is still a huge amount of scholarly discussion and disagreement about it, about how and why it happened. What everyone seems to accept is that just before it happened, Titus held a kind of conference. In Latin, they call it a concilium, which is a sort of a gathering together of the main generals or commanders by the overall commander to kind of get opinions about what should be done in a particular action. So Titus had a concilium, a conference about what they would do with the temple. And there were varying opinions given. But where Titus came out was that they should not destroy the temple. Or at least that's what Josephus says. So going into the last few days, Josephus describes the Romans making a kind of sudden breakthrough that allowed a large number of Roman soldiers to get up onto the Temple Mount itself. And there was resistance there. There was fighting on top of the Temple Mount, during which Titus was taking a nap somehow. And someone woke him up, and he charged off and made his way through this breach point and joined the soldiers there. And Josephus says that Titus attempted to stop his soldiers from burning or throwing firebrands toward or into the buildings, because there wasn't just the temple up there, but several buildings. But he was unable to stop them. He himself went into the temple and entered into the Holy of Holies. Josephus doesn't say what he saw there. I argue in my book that he probably saw very little, because I think it's very likely that the ark and or the golden candelabra, the menorah, were taken out of there and put someplace safe. But if he went into the Holy of Holies, no doubt he saw the foundation rock there. Then he came out, and a soldier threw some sort of firebrand in a window, which started a fire in the temple building. So that's kind of the story that Josephus tells. The fire started to burn out of control, and it was impossible to put it out. So after the time of Josephus, there were a number of later sources, including a usually very reliable 3rd century Roman historian called Cassius Dio, who implies in his account of this that Titus destroyed the temple intentionally. Christian sources from the 4th and 5th century CE, I'm thinking here of people like Sulpicius Severus and Orosius, also claimed that he did it on purpose, although their reasoning about this was that this was done because Judaism was going to be superseded after the destruction of the temple by Christianity. So where does that lead us? So to be neutral and fair, there are Roman historians, very good Roman historians, who argue that that this was unintentional, that it was essentially an accident on Titus's part. And then there are historians who argue that no, it was intentional from the beginning, and that essentially the concilium was kind of a cover story that was used by Josephus and his friend and mentor, later mentor, Titus, used to excuse Titus or absolve him of responsibility. I have a different take on this. My take is that Titus was the commander of the Roman army in Jerusalem. By the time Titus got to the point where he was taking a nap with his soldiers, climbing up on the Temple Mount after what was probably a 4-month-long siege during the summertime of 70. I mean, I'm sure that most of your listeners will have been to Jerusalem during the summertime. You know what it's like there. Imagine, wearing body armor and fighting. And as I said a few minutes ago, losing many encounters and colleagues and friends. Now suddenly, the Romans burst through onto the temple, their ultimate objective. This was a foreseeable scenario on Titus's part. And as such, if you think about putting yourself in that position as a commander, I find it very, very hard to believe that a commander wouldn't use his command structure through the legions and auxiliaries to say, right, if anybody starts throwing firebrands into the temple, they're going to be executed. That's it. Titus could have done that. He could have issued commands that strong. So Josephus never says that. So either he didn't do that, or alternatively, something which I think is just as revealing, he was too weak as a commander for his soldiers seeing him on the spot, the commander-in-chief, as Josephus says, telling them, don't do that. He says they didn't do it. They wouldn't stop. So my take on this is that he was, in fact, he bore moral responsibility for it. And as supporting evidence for that, we'll talk about this during our last session. After the destruction of the temple and large sections of the city of Jerusalem, when Titus went back to Rome and he and his father celebrated their triumph in June of 71, subsequently, they had put up victory monuments for this war. Even though the war wasn't over, they began the planning for them, in which they celebrated the destruction of Jerusalem. On the Arch of Titus in the Roman Forum, the most famous frieze probably in Roman art history shows Roman soldiers carting away the treasures from the temple that does not sound like an apology for what they did. So putting two and two together, I think the outlier in this story of how and why the temple was destroyed is Josephus's account, not the rest of the media and monuments that were created by the people who did it in Rome itself. So,
and I'll just jump in. I'm sure many of the listeners are familiar with Chazal and the Gemara, but the Gemara is about Titus. Another thing, just wanted to mention about Josephus, though, that is, you mentioned but with the fire and what was happening. I mean, it is, anyone who didn't read it, it is definitely worth reading Josephus, especially this time period, with the 3 weeks. And how he describes it, it's moving and it's graphic, and what was going on as the temple as it's burning down, and there's just bodies, people running everywhere and dying, and it's extremely sad. It's poignant just to read the description in Josephus.
No, it's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. The description of it. I mean, it's kind of historically, factually, it's a horrible thing. And it's in fact, one of the reasons why I sort of persevered in writing this book, because in the scholarship about what happened there, a lot of scholars have pointed out that there were a lot of temples that were burned down, that were destroyed in the ancient world. But in fact, this was really the temple for a people. So it takes on another level of significance altogether. And Josephus, we've talked about Josephus and his complicated background, his complicated history, but as a writer, as kind of an artist, a historian, that description, as you say, of the destruction of the temple and the sound of it and the sights of it and the people, I think rises to a level that's as high as anything you'll find in ancient history writing. It's an amazing account. So yes, even though I think it can be problematic for people to read and emotional, it's worth reading, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so then, if there's anything else, this is basically more or less the end of this episode.
Yes.
There's a couple other things you want to just mention, but we'll basically more or less pick up next episode with what happened after. I don't know if you wanted to discuss now after the destruction and the enslaved and the killed and all the those that killed, and then the art, Titus and Vespasian. We should just leave that better for the next episode.
I think we should leave it for next time. It's all kind of part of the aftermath of the destruction and its consequences.
Perfect. So that just teased already what part of it will be in the next episode, and we'll discuss the aftermath, the conclusion, the unfortunate aftermath, and a couple other things to tie this up. So once again, I'll put a link in the show's notes for the book. I don't think I mentioned this in the first episode. I'll put a link. There's a nice, the Oxford Classics edition of the Jewish War of Josephus is pretty cheap. It's like $10 to $15, and it's very nice. I'll put a link that also anyone who wants to read the actual Josephus as well. I'll try to link those two things. Of course, there's also editions in Hebrew and other things.
Yeah, of course.
But I want to mention that as well. And, with that, thank you once again for joining me.
Thank you. Yeah.